today's talk, we have Brian Perry on an overview of front-end component integration methods, Decoupled edition. Take it away.
Thank you. And sorry to make you say that extremely long title. I need to work on my session title editing. But yeah, really happy to be at this virtual Decoupled days and talking about components, my favorite thing always. So I am Brian Perry. I'm a lead front-end developer at a company called Bounteous, and I live in the Chicago suburbs. And I'm a lover of all things component-based. So building and theming with components in Drupal, design systems and tools like Pattern Lab and Storybook, and increasingly building with component-based JavaScript frameworks like React in the bunch. And obviously that's all quite relevant to what we're going to be talking about today. And also a lover of all things Nintendo. So happy to talk about the cool games everybody's playing on their Switch. For me, it's still Animal Crossing, and my son and I have started playing Paper Mario: The Origami King, which is really great. And it's a bummer to not be in person because every year that I go to Decoupled days, I also go to Nintendo New York, which probably isn't even open now. And I am available on the internet in a variety of places and would love to internet with you. And as I mentioned, I work at a company called Bounteous, and back when offices were a thing, I mean, we still have offices, just nobody's in them. We have offices throughout North America. I was based out of one of our Chicago offices when I was in the office. Drupal is one of a handful of things that we do, but I primarily work within our Drupal practice and work with a great team of Drupalists and learn things from them on a day in, day out basis. And if you're looking to do great Drupal work, we're often hiring. And if you're looking to have great Drupal work done, I can definitely get in touch with somebody. So I did want to just briefly acknowledge, the interesting state that we're in, mainly just from the perspective of the fact that, being stuck in my home, it's been really meaningful to be part of this this larger Drupal community and contributing back to the project. And then also, it's important to be part of this community that takes diversity and inclusion seriously and also seems to be acknowledging and trying to improve mistakes as a community. So hopefully in the future, we can all be in person together. But even now, remotely, I'm happy to be doing what we're doing. And also, as was mentioned, feel free to use the chat and drop in questions that we should have some time for at the end. And let's dive in. So, we're going to be talking about different ways to provide data to your components and decoupled projects. And also kind of starting from the framework of a talk that I've given a few times, looking at this from the more traditional CMS perspective. And because it's this specific audience, I don't think I'm really going to have to sell components or component-based development all that much. In general, this is the way that people are building front-end components, and it's not a fad. It's going to be here for a while, and I would think that is something that that most people on this this session agree with. So where we'll get started is I built a little example web component for some of the examples in this talk. So we'll take a look at that. Was not kidding about my affinity for Nintendo. So I used the NES.CSS framework that lets you easily style things to look kind of old school Nintendo and pixelated. It's pretty cool. And used their container component, which we see an example of on the left-hand side. So this is just an example of basically the variables that exist in this component that we're going to be passing data into: title, platform, year, image, body text, etc. And then, so I created this component in Vue. I'm actually relatively new to Vue, so my apologies if I have some garbage Vue code in here. But I wanted to experiment with Vue's ability to create, use web components as a build target, which is what I ended up doing here. But you'll see that I'm using a single file component here. So within the template, we have kind of the general markup that we need, slots for all of the variables that we talked about before. We're also using the classes that we need from the nes.css framework. And then in the script section, we're really not doing much, at least in this kind of presentational component. We really just have the props that relate to the variables that are going to be passed into this thing. And then we have some styles defined. Mostly, it's just importing the nes.css styles, some fonts, and a little bit lower, there's a few minor styling tweaks that we make. So also using Storybook with this, there was a bit.ly link on one of the earlier slides. I think it was bit.ly/component-int-dd. That's a link to the slides that we're going through, and also there should be a link to a GitHub repository that's kind of a work in progress, but has some of these examples. Hope to expand that out more. But there's a Storybook instance in there that provides an example of this component. So we're importing the component, and then we have a file that has some example data to show the example that we've seen a handful of times already, importing the image. And then really all we're doing here is rendering the container component with the example data that we have. So we can see what it looks like and all kinds of cool things you can do in Storybook, like change the props to see how it responds. And then we also built just like a little grid layout for this component, so we could have different games in these containers in a 3-up grid. And so I just created a grid component here. Really all it is just a kind of a wrapper and a slot that we can pass these containers into. And then some scope styles that use CSS grid at a number of different responsive breakpoints to do that 3-up grid. So now we're going to start out kind of revisiting the kind of more Drupal-focused talk about integrating components that I've done. So thinking a little bit about twig components in Drupal first. So really summarizing that talk at a super high level, but there were kind of 3 main questions that I landed on to kind of think about how you could provide data to your twig components. And they're, where do my components live? How am I providing data to my components? And how is Drupal made aware of my components? So I want to look at each 3 of those questions and kind of think a little bit about what the decoupled analog would be. Sometimes it's a little bit of a stretch, but still works as a pretty decent framework for what we're going to talk about. So first, where do my components live? So from the kind of traditional CMS perspective, the dividing line that I had here was standard Drupal components versus integrated Drupal components. So really the distinction there is standard Drupal component is something that lives in Drupal's template directory, basically where Drupal expects to find it. And as a result, will not require much effort to get data to display in it. And then an integrated Drupal component is a component that lives anywhere but that default templates directory, which means that there's going to be some amount of effort to be able to provide the data to your front-end component. So what's the kind of decoupled analog to this? So in this case, I think it's really where your components are being rendered, who's handling the rendering, which kind of ties into the concepts of progressive decoupling and full decoupling. So for progressive decoupling, Drupal is going to be handling the initial page request, but then yielding some portion of the page to your JavaScript framework or components. But because of that, Drupal has some level of visibility into your components and what's being rendered on the page. Probably not full visibility, but some. And then full decoupling, Drupal is just providing data. And as a result, Drupal might not know anything about how what is consuming the data from its API is doing to render it. So we'll first look at progressive decoupling a bit. So on the Drupal side, created a content type called game that basically just has the fields that we need to render this container. And then on the view side, I created a container block component. Now, this is a really contrived example, but I think still works for what we're exploring here. So it's just what it's doing is it's hitting JSON API and getting the data for a particular game based on a UUID that's passed in, and then just passing all that to the container component that we've defined, the presentational component. This is a contrived example because, I mean, you could just render the thing with Drupal instead. But, I mean, it would apply if you weren't using a Drupal API. So we're going to look at a few different ways to create this, a block that renders that container based on what we've built. So the first thing we'll look at is like a roll your own approach. So we're just going to create a block in Drupal that is going to spit out that container component. And it's potentially more work than you'd expect. And it's definitely not something that's going to be friendly to a JavaScript developer. They'd probably need help from someone from the Drupal perspective to get all these pieces together. And it might be a lot of little things, but there's a lot that you, or at least I had to do in this case, to create a block, a custom block that would render the container. So I created a custom block type. And then I had to add a library that is going to load the different assets. So the web component itself, some dependencies. I had to create a theme hook so that I could create a template suggestion for it that I could override. And then I had to do a little bit of pre-processing on the block. I added the library that we defined, and also the going back to the custom block, there's just one field that's an entity reference to a piece of game content. And we're just getting the UUID for that and passing that into our web component. And then in the template, we are just rendering out our NES container custom element, and then also setting a UUID attribute so that it knows what to get from JSON API. And yes, so much Drupal. And yeah, maybe we need a PHP nap after that. I mean, I take a lot of PHP naps personally. But at the end of the day, it does work, even though there's a lot of pieces, and this is a relatively contrived example. I'm still able to, after setting that up, go into Layout Builder and add this example decoupled block, pick the game node that I want to render, and place it, and we get our game, just like we would expect. So, a lot of what we'll be looking at for the rest of this talk is kind of what's available in the community to make some of this stuff easier, or to kind of provide a standard approach. So I wanted to look at, how we could, eliminate some of that work and boilerplate that we just looked at to make that block. So kind of the OG example is the progressively decoupled blocks module. I wouldn't be shocked if there are people kicking around, or even in this talk, that have contributed to this or used it. So it provides a convention for exposing JavaScript-powered blocks to Drupal. The components are defined in a info.yaml file. And there's a handful of things that simplify the framework integration as well. Like there's a Angular version of the module, a Drupal version of the module that's going to load dependencies for the frameworks and things like that. So this should cut down on the amount of additional places that you need to set up your block. A lot of the work is done in that info.yaml file. I will admit that I personally haven't used decoupled blocks too much myself. But it's definitely something that's been used out in the community to simplify this process. Recently, I was introduced to the component module, component singular, not component plural. There's also a popular component module. And this is very directly inspired by progressively decoupled blocks, it appears, and does some similar stuff. It defines your component in a component.yaml file. You could have multiple components in a single module. It's going to, you can define, and then it will then create the necessary libraries for you, CSS and JS assets. You can define a form for block configuration in the YAML file as well. You can provide caching settings and probably some stuff that I haven't been able to experiment with quite yet. So since I've wanted to try this out, I took this, used this module to basically do the same thing that we did with a little roll your own example. So I just want to have a block that lets me render out that container, and I want to just be able to, in block settings, just provide the values that I want to spit out in my web component. So here's a look at the YAML file. We define our JavaScript libraries that need to be loaded. And for form configuration, it's pretty simple, though. We just have a handful of text fields that we want to render. I didn't, as I mentioned, some of the examples for this, I didn't quite get where I wanted to be, so I wasn't able to put an example of an image in here. But yeah, so in this case, just a handful of text fields. On the right, you can see the structure of the custom module. There's the YAML file. There's the built JavaScript for the web component, and there's an index.html file. So looking at that index, thinking about that index.html file, really all it does is render the NES container custom element. But the way the module works, and again, I'm new to this specific module, so there might be more elegant ways to do this, or maybe this is just something that could be enhanced in the future. But it basically takes all of the form values that you specify. For an example that's been rendered, it just passes those through automatically as data attributes. So we have our title, our platform, all that stuff in a wrapping div. And then inside of it, we have our NES container web component. So what I really wanted to do is I want those data attributes to be passed down to my container component. It would be great if there was some automated way to do that. Step what we end up doing is adjust that container block component, the kind of wrapper that we saw before, and just get all of the data attributes from the parent div and just pass those in as props to the container component. But pretty straightforward, potentially just a couple lines of boilerplate there. And this is what the block config looks like. So you can go ahead and add the block anywhere you can add blocks in the UI, and we just see the text fields in this case for our settings for the component, and we get our NES container as we expect with the data passed into it. And then, so if we want to do something like our grid layout, or maybe even have like a simple search that lets you search between the games, that might be a situation where maybe it's still a progressively decoupled approach, but the majority of this one specific route we want to hand over to our view application. So that's something I've done on projects previously, and custom code to do it. And I've seen other talks where people go over the custom code necessary to do this. You have to define your route and make sure that Drupal is not going to take over your router, your JavaScript router's namespace. But I've recently seen that there is a decoupled pages module that provides kind of a standard approach to doing this, which I think is great. And I'm looking to use it in the future. So it allows you to kind of easily define a route that is going to be taken over by your JavaScript app. And there's certainly a lot more than it can do. You can define additional sub-routes within it. Again, I haven't personally used this too much, but I've basically written it before. So excited that it exists. See some questions coming through in the chat, which is great. So now we'll take a look at some fully decoupled concepts. And this kind of leads back into those three questions. So again, from the more traditional CMS perspective, another kind of dividing line was, how am I providing data to my components? So the integration approach. And for more kind of twig specific approaches, it's split by mapping data in code or mapping data in the admin UI. So mapping data in code includes things like mapping in twig templates using the presenter template concept, pre-processing to prep data into the variables that you need, or really kind of any backend code approach. And then there are a handful of ways to do that in the UI now. There's the UI patterns modules. You can do that with layouts in Drupal as well. So, wondering what the decoupled analog would be. There might kind of be some exceptions. I'm really proud of that X that I drew there. But really, you're handling this in code in some way at the end of the day. So there really isn't a direct analog here, but how you're going to provide the data to your application. On the Drupal side, there's mainly in the community JSON API and GraphQL as kind of popular options. There's also core REST, but it seems like the community in general has kind of moved away from that. And I'm sure there are other alternatives, but and I would also imagine that many folks are probably familiar with these options on this session, but JSON API is in core, and it provides an API that follows the JSON API spec. And it also has a growing contrib ecosystem. Typically, it's going to result in multiple endpoints, but you can still very efficiently define queries that have relationships to other entities in Drupal and things like that. And then GraphQL is it's very popular in the React ecosystem, but also seems to be getting its hooks outside of that. And it definitely seems to be more focused on combining data from multiple sources and providing easy ways to customize your schema. I do like that while there was an accidental chat mentioned in the chat window, it at least is Nintendo related. So I think it might be the right chat window. Anyway, so between those two things, JSON API and GraphQL, I am not going to stand up here and provide a strong argument in favor of one or the other. I do think that if your team is inclined to use GraphQL or would be better suited using GraphQL, you may already know that, and it won't be much of a decision for you. The teams at Bounteous, from my experience, have mostly been using JSON API. The main reason probably being that the shape of a JSON API response seems to be something that our developers are pretty familiar with and kind of know how to work with. The fact that it's now in core obviously is a big selling point for it. But just in general, we don't really have, from my kind of limited perspective, consistent adoption of GraphQL across the different practices, like outside of the Drupal practice. Obviously, the React folks use it, so there may be cases where it might make sense there. But in general, more folks throughout the company are going to be able to pick up and run with a JSON API style response. So talking a little bit about the ecosystem, a lot of great supporting modules here. So there's JSON API extras, which is often commonly used with JSON API. It lets you kind of customize things, enable or disable particular resources, rename them. You can configure field enhancers to adjust the way the data for a particular field is going to be represented in the response, and a handful of other tricks. There's also the JSON API include module, which makes it easier to access relationship data. So JSON API has the concept of relationships. From a Drupal perspective, those are often going to be like referenced entities. So by default, it's just going to provide an ID for that relationship. You can specify in your query that you want to include the data for it. And then it will have kind of the included data for those entities in its result set. But JSON API include basically allows you to kind of include that data automatically and also have it a little bit closer to the field that makes the reference. So potentially it's easier to get at. But also, potentially is going to inflate the size of the response. So, it depends on what you're looking to do. And then there's JSON API Search API, which involves the word API or the API a number of times. And it's pretty self-explanatory. It lets you access via JSON API, Search API. There's JSON API Explorer, which is a nice UI to query JSON API. It's definitely inspired by Graphical, which is the GraphQL tool that kind of, I think, came first. And then there's also the JSON API cross bundles module. So this one also is somewhat self-explanatory in that your JSON API requests are kind of, say JSON API enough time it starts sounding strange. It also, like, on the slide is starting to blur out and not even be letters. So typically JSON API is going to be confined to one bundle and you can't reach across them, but JSON API will allow you to do that. I believe in the kind of Drupal commerce ecosystem for some of the decoupled work there, it's really important for them to be able to do that. And I think they have been involved in development on that. So definitely a lot of great things that can help you use JSON API out in the ecosystem. But one thing that I have personally struggled with on projects that use JSON API is what the right way to customize and extend JSON API and JSON API responses is. This is definitely a situation where I don't consider myself someone who has the definitive answer here, although I have some ideas, but I'd love for anybody who has experience doing this in the top of chat to feel free to school me on this one. But so for smaller scale customizations, there is a Lullabot blog post that I've referenced, and it outlines 3 different support to do this. So these are kind of smaller scale customizations to existing endpoints. You can create a computed field, which is something that I have done in the past. You can write a normalizer at the data type level. And I will admit, as a predominantly front-end guy, I would not do that because I'm not even sure what that is. And you can also create a field enhancer plugin using JSON API extras. So as I mentioned, JSON API extras lets you specify a field enhancer that changes how the field is going to be represented in a response. So you can create your own custom version of that, which could do a number of things. And Jordan in the chat also mentioned JSON API hypermedia, just giving me a way to say JSON API a little bit more as another ecosystem module. It's one that I haven't used too much personally. Brian's asking if the slides are going to be available. Yes, they definitely are. All right, I'll keep going with the slides and get back to some of the questions. So another thing that I ran into is, what about a completely custom endpoint? So the particular example that I had to deal with, we wanted to be able to proxy a completely non-Drupal service, but provide it in a consistent way. We want to be able to use Core's default JSON API endpoints along with this custom endpoint where we're proxying a completely different service, but just provide a consistent set of responses that follow the JSON API spec. And it wasn't, this was kind of relatively early days for JSON API, and it really wasn't clear to me what the right way to do this was. We ended up kind of rolling our own approach for this, which certainly has some disadvantages. But we use the JSON API PHP composer package for this, which is a nice implementation of the JSON API spec. But I definitely do, worry about kind of long-term maintenance issues, and also it being so custom, it's a little bit less kind of hooked into what Drupal can offer with JSON API. But revisiting this question, it seems like there are some more Drupal-y options. So there's the JSON API resources module, and this seems to be the most official way to be able to provide a completely custom endpoint that's still in the JSON API namespace in Drupal. And then it also includes examples that show you, how you can do this using what JSON API offers behind the scenes. So if I was to do this again in the future, that would definitely be what I would look at first. There's also the API proxy module, which just seems specifically tailored to this use case of proxying completely different services on the Drupal side. So that also, if I had to do this this proxying situation as well, I'd look at that too. So last question, kind of looking back at the more traditional CMS view of this, how is Drupal made aware of my components? So, on the Twig component side, the last kind of fork in the road was manual definition versus automatic discovery. So manual definition is defining things in code to make Drupal aware of it, and is going to require some amount of duplication typically between Drupal and your component library, like redefining the fields that your pattern library already knows about, for example. Versus automatic discovery, which is kind of an emerging or experimental concept where there's a handful of Drupal modules that can automatically discover components from your component library. There's a handful of them for Pattern Lab, and then automatically make them available to Drupal as UI patterns or layouts. So, again, wondering if there is a kind of decoupled analog for this. And it feels like the closest thing is definitely kind of what the promise of Gatsby and what Gatsby is trying to offer here, what they call the content mesh. But the idea that they have a number of really well fleshed out plugins that let you get data from a variety of data sources, including Drupal, and then make that all available into your combined GraphQL schema. So, it's not going to be fully automated there, but getting the data, it can easily discover what Drupal offers via JSON API and have that available for you to build off of. But then kind of taking that one step further, I have experimented a little bit with Gatsby themes kind of in this neighborhood. This is definitely something that I've taken kind of initial shot at and have had to kind of put down. So needs to be revisited. But the general idea is using Gatsby themes to be able to provide kind of like a single purpose slice of something that can be compatible with Gatsby. So there's a Gatsby theme, in this case, Gatsby theme Drupal Markdown post, and a Gatsby Markdown post module. So what the Drupal module does is it just provides a specific content type that allows you to enter in Markdown data and images. And then the Gatsby theme will automatically pick up on it and give you pages and components that can automatically render that Markdown. So, definitely something that I'm hoping to revisit. But, as far as automating kind of some of this process, I think the idea of having these kind of single purpose modules or themes that can be composed together provides some interesting possibilities. And then also kind of looking forward to the future, those who saw the Dries note, there's definitely interesting discussion about our trying to build a decoupled menu component in a couple of different frameworks. And a lot of what I've kind of been getting at here is I think there's a lot of great answers, and a lot of people have solved a number of these problems that we're talking about today. But from my perspective anyway, I found it and continue to find it a little bit difficult to kind of understand what the kind of common best practices is and what's the most common approach to solve some of these problems in the community. So I'm really looking forward to this being a way potentially to create more clearly defined patterns for this type of thing that will, aid this work, but also something that could influence how we approach decoupled Drupal projects in the future. And plus, just the idea of having a bunch of blessed Drupal components is also awesome. So as I mentioned, I had a little sandbox repo that I was working at to support some of these examples. Didn't quite finish my homework on this one, but do hope to continue fleshing it out. I'll post the bit.ly link in the chat as we get into questions. So the slides are up, and then also this repo is here, and I hope to keep fleshing it out so we can have some examples to reference. And that leaves some time for questions, I believe, and I saw a few come through in the chat, which is amazing.
I think I'm going to scroll back up and look through. So the first one that I saw after I asked was Ofer Shaw. Did you have a chance to check out the Drupal project component blocks?
Component blocks? I don't think I have, but I will.
So the next one came from Joe Johnson. That I actually have the same question. Is there any way to load React View in such a way that Drupal doesn't have to reload the library when you change URLs? I find that re-rendering the whole thing on each endpoint is expensive on load time.
Yeah, there are definitely ways to do that, and it kind of depends on the structure of your project. But so is it about loading the library, or really just the overall kind of full page refresh in that case, or both?
Will you elaborate on both?
Yeah, I will. Okay, so like in the examples that we saw in the progressively decoupled case, for the component, we had view as a dependency of it. So when that component loads, it's going to try to load view. If we had multiple view components that were used throughout the site, I don't think I would have view as part of that library. There would be a library that loads view, and it may do it, depending on how commonly you're using these view components, it might do it as like a global library. And then the other components would have that as a dependency. So, in general, view would be loaded once. And then as far as, the kind of full page refresh. So if, you're in a situation where going from page to page, Drupal is handling the route and you'd rather have your framework handle the route, that's probably a situation where either I'd look at the approach used by that decoupled pages module, where you can define like a namespaced route inside of your app. Like, for example, the project that I'm working right now has a authenticated user portal, and at /portal, we're basically saying, hand that over to React and React Router. So everything inside of that portal namespace is handled by React, and the page will never refresh. But if you go outside of that, Drupal takes over routing. And it also might be a situation where, depending on what you're trying to do, you might want to reconsider progressively decoupling versus fully decoupling as well.
I answered this before. I have Jesus on. Are you aware of any Drupal allows to implement React components to reuse together with a React app, aka Gatsby Next.js?
No, I'm not, and that is a question that I've heard a couple of times recently. I'd be interested if anybody else in the chat has options for that. But yeah, the closest thing I've seen is some approaches to using Gatsby themes to provide stuff like that. But I'd say it's also pretty early. But yeah, I would also say that seems like something that a lot of people are interested in doing.
Chat room, are there any more questions? John, why are we asking component blocks again? Okay. Let's see. I don't see anything.
Yeah, I'll definitely say, always happy to talk about this. So feel free to, track me down on Twitter or any of the various Slacks, and, happy to chat more.
Thank you very much, Brian, for sharing this with us.
Oh, John had a last question. I'm seeing, is this the same concept of web components? Yeah, it can and it can't be. So it's basically, the examples that we saw are basically, any way to have a JavaScript component that Drupal provides data to. So that could be using React, it could be using Vue, it could be using Svelte, it could be using any fancy framework. Or alternatively, you could also a web component, which is like a specific JavaScript API to create a custom element. I'm still kind of getting my feet wet with them. But that has the advantage of it's not going to have to load a full framework necessarily. And then Vue has the ability to use web components as a build target. So Drupal component equals Drupal plus web component. Yeah, it can. Kind of.
Okay. Thanks again, Brian.